What if I told you that a future president of the United States was nearly eaten by Japanese officers on a remote Pacific island? That on September 2nd, 1944, 9 American airmen were shot down over the same island, and only one survived, rescued by a submarine crew while the other 8 were captured, tortured, executed, and then cannibalized by Japanese military officers in drunken banquets? That George Bush, the 41st president, was that one survivor saved by pure chance while his squadron mates suffered a fate so horrific it was hidden from the public for decades? This is the story of Chichijima, a tiny island that became the site of one of World War II's most disturbing war crimes. A story of survival, savagery, and the thin line between rescue and unspeakable death. And the darkest part? The officers who committed these atrocities weren't monsters. They were educated men who chose barbarism. Chichijima is a small volcanic island in the Pacific, roughly 150 miles north of Iwo Jima, part of the Bonin Islands chain. Before the war, it was an unremarkable place. A few hundred Japanese and European settlers, some farmland, clear water, and beautiful scenery. Remote and peaceful. But by 1944, Chichijima had been transformed into a heavily fortified Japanese military outpost. The island held no particular strategic value. It was too small for major airfields or fleet anchorages, but its location made it useful as a communications relay station and early warning post. The Japanese garrison numbered about 25,000 troops, far more than the island's size warranted, dug into caves and bunkers with orders to defend to the death. By summer 1944, the Pacific War had turned decisively against Japan. American forces were island-hopping toward the Japanese homeland. Air supremacy belonged to the U.S. Navy, whose carrier-based aircraft ranged freely across the Pacific, striking Japanese positions with impunity. Chichijima, with its radio stations and supply depots, became a regular target for American bombing raids. The raids were conducted by squadrons of TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, 3-man aircraft carrying pilots, radio men, and gunners. These were dangerous missions. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense, and being shot down over Japanese-held territory meant almost certain death, either from the crash itself or from what came after. The American pilots knew the risks. They'd heard the stories about what happened to captured airmen. Some carried extra ammunition with instructions to save the last bullet for themselves rather than be captured. On September 2nd, 1944, a strike force from the USS San Jacinto approached Chichijima to bomb the island's communications facilities. Among the pilots was a young lieutenant junior grade named George Herbert Walker Bush. He was 20 years old, one of the youngest naval aviators in the Pacific. He'd enlisted on his 18th birthday the day after Pearl Harbor, postponing his admission to Yale to serve his country. He'd completed flight training and been assigned to Torpedo Squadron 51. This was his 58th combat mission. It would nearly be his last. At approximately 8 a.m. on September 2nd, Bush's Avenger approached Chichijima at 10,000 feet. The mission was straightforward. Bomb the radio station, avoid the anti-aircraft fire, return to the carrier. But the Japanese gunners on Chichijima were experienced and well-prepared. They'd been bombed repeatedly and had learned to track the American aircraft patterns. As Bush began his bombing run, Japanese anti-aircraft shells bracketed his aircraft. One shell burst close enough to damage the engine. Smoke began pouring from the Avenger. Bush had seconds to decide: abort immediately or complete the bombing run. He completed the run, released his bombs, scoring hits on the radio facility, and then turned toward the ocean. His aircraft was on fire, losing altitude rapidly, and he was still over enemy territory. His 2 crewmen, radio man John Delaney and gunner William White, were in the rear of the aircraft. In the chaos and smoke, Bush couldn't see if they were alive or wounded. At about 2,000 feet, with the aircraft shaking apart and flames spreading, Bush gave the order to bail out. He went out the canopy, pulled his ripcord too early, and slammed into the aircraft's tail section. The impact tore his parachute and gashed his head. He hit the water hard, barely conscious, bleeding from the head wound. His parachute deflated and began dragging him under. Bush inflated his life raft, a tiny rubber raft barely large enough for one person, and hauled himself into it. He was about 3 miles from Chichijima, close enough to see the island clearly. Close enough that Japanese troops on shore could see him. He looked around desperately for his 2 crewmen. He never saw them again. To this day, it's unclear if Delaney and White died in the aircraft during the bailout or after hitting the water. Bush watched the sky and water for any sign of parachutes or survivors. There were none. What Bush didn't know was that he wasn't alone. 4 other American aircraft had been shot down that same day over Chichijima. 8 other American airmen had bailed out or crashed near the island, and Japanese patrol boats were already moving to capture them. Bush drifted in his raft, bleeding, vomiting from seawater he'd swallowed, and desperately paddling away from Chichijima. The current was pulling him toward the island, toward certain capture. Japanese patrol boats were launching from the harbor. He could see them coming. He paddled frantically, making almost no progress against the current. Then American aircraft appeared overhead, fighters from his squadron circling to provide cover. They could see Japanese boats approaching Bush's raft. They strafed the boats, forcing them to retreat temporarily. But Bush was still drifting toward the island. The fighters couldn't protect him indefinitely. Their fuel would run out. The Japanese boats would return. Bush paddled for 3 hours, making inches of progress at a time. Then, at approximately 11:30 a.m., the conning tower of an American submarine broke the surface just 50 yards from his raft. It was the USS Finback, a submarine that had been stationed near Chichijima specifically to rescue downed airmen. The submarine crew pulled Bush aboard. He was safe. The entire rescue had taken about 3.5 hours from the time he hit the water. 3.5 hours that separated life from a fate worse than death. Because while Bush was being pulled aboard the Finback, the 8 other American airmen shot down that day were being captured by Japanese patrol boats and taken to shore. Bush would spend the next month aboard the Finback, participating in submarine patrols and rescue operations. He would survive the war, return home, attend Yale, enter politics, and eventually become the 41st President of the United States. The other 8 men would experience something so horrific that the details would be suppressed for decades. The 8 captured American airmen were brought to Chichijima and imprisoned in the island's garrison headquarters. They were Marv Mershon, pilot; Floyd Hall, radio man; Grady York, radio man; Glenn Frazier, gunner; James Dye, pilot; Warren Earl Vaughn, pilot; and 2 others whose identities were never conclusively established due to incomplete records. All were young men in their early 20s. All had families waiting for them at home. All were now prisoners of war, entitled under the Geneva Conventions to humane treatment. What happened next violated every law of war and every standard of human decency. The ranking Japanese officer on Chichijima was Major Sueo Matoba, commander of the island's garrison. Under normal circumstances, American POWs would be interrogated for intelligence value and then transferred to prisoner of war camps on the Japanese mainland. But Chichijima was isolated, under constant bombardment, and effectively cut off from higher command. Major Matoba had near absolute authority on the island, and Matoba, along with several other officers, made a decision that would damn them all. The American prisoners were interrogated brutally. They were beaten, tortured for information about American fleet movements and bombing targets. Several were subjected to water torture, what we now call waterboarding. The interrogations yielded nothing useful. The airmen were low-ranking enlisted men and junior officers who knew only their specific missions, nothing about broader strategic plans. Having extracted no useful intelligence, a normal commanding officer would have imprisoned the men until war's end. Instead, Matoba decided they should be executed. This was already a war crime. Executing prisoners of war who had surrendered was prohibited under international law, but the execution itself would have been the least of the crimes committed on Chichijima. Between September and December 1944, the 8 American prisoners were executed one by one in a series of grotesque ceremonies that transformed murder into ritualized savagery. The executions followed a pattern. A prisoner would be brought from his cell, tied to a post, and executed, sometimes by beheading with a samurai sword, sometimes by bayoneting, sometimes by being beaten to death with clubs and stones. The executions were conducted as entertainment. Japanese officers and enlisted men gathered to watch. Sake flowed freely. The executions became drunken spectacles. But the true horror came after the executions. The bodies were butchered. Livers, hearts, and other organs were removed and delivered to the officers' mess hall, where they were prepared as food and served at banquets. The officers ate their victims. After the war, when investigators began piecing together what happened on Chichijima, the initial reports were so shocking that many assumed they were exaggerations or propaganda. But testimony from Japanese soldiers who had been present, combined with physical evidence and written records, confirmed the horrifying truth. Major Matoba didn't just order the executions. He participated in the cannibalism and encouraged his officers to do the same. According to witness testimony from the war crimes trials, after one execution, the body was taken to the garrison hospital where a medical officer, Captain Teruo Nakajima, removed the liver. The liver was then taken to the officers' mess where the cook prepared it as yakitori, grilled meat on skewers. The officers ate it at a banquet, washed down with sake. This wasn't an isolated incident driven by starvation. The Japanese garrison on Chichijima was not starving. They had adequate food supplies. The cannibalism was not a desperate act of survival. It was ritualistic, celebratory, a perverse demonstration of power and contempt. Some officers later claimed they believed eating their enemies' organs would give them strength and courage. A grotesque perversion of ancient warrior beliefs about absorbing an enemy's spirit. Others simply admitted they did it because they could, because in the isolated command structure of Chichijima, there were no consequences, because the prisoners were seen as less than human. One Japanese officer who refused to participate later testified, "I told them it was barbaric and shameful. They laughed at me and called me weak. They said the Americans would have done the same to us if positions were reversed." This was a lie. American forces, despite occasional individual atrocities, never engaged in systematic cannibalism of prisoners. The comparison was false equivalence meant to justify the unjustifiable. At least 5 of the 8 American prisoners were partially cannibalized after execution. Their livers, hearts, and other organs were removed, cooked and consumed by Japanese officers. The remaining body parts were buried in shallow graves or thrown into the ocean. When the war ended in August 1945, the perpetrators assumed their crimes would remain hidden. They destroyed records, threatened witnesses, and prepared false accounts claiming the Americans had died in the bombings or in combat. But American investigators were thorough, and they had informants. In September 1945, as American occupation forces secured Japanese territories, investigators began looking into reports of missing airmen. The records showed that 9 American aviators had been shot down over Chichijima on September 2, 1944. One, George H.W. Bush, had been rescued. The other 8 were listed as missing in action. Families back home clung to hope that their sons might be in prisoner of war camps, awaiting repatriation. But as investigators interviewed Japanese soldiers from the Chichijima garrison, a darker picture emerged. Initially, Japanese officers maintained that the American prisoners had died during bombing raids or had been killed in combat. But the stories didn't match. Details contradicted. Some soldiers, guilty and traumatized by what they'd witnessed, began talking. One medical orderly, Tadao Yoshi, provided detailed testimony about being ordered to extract organs from executed prisoners. His account was so specific, including dates, names of officers present, and descriptions of the ceremonies, that investigators knew it couldn't be fabricated. Other soldiers corroborated the account. Some provided written evidence, notes and orders they'd kept hidden. By early 1946, American investigators had enough evidence to bring charges. In September 1946, war crimes trials began on Guam. 5 Japanese officers were charged with murder, cannibalism, and violations of the laws of war. Major Sueo Matoba, Garrison Commander, Captain Shizuo Yoshi, Chief Medical Officer, Captain Teruo Nakajima, Medical Officer who performed the organ extractions, Admiral Kaniso Mori, Regional Naval Commander, General Yoshio Tachibana, Commander of the Bonin Islands. The trials were meticulous. Prosecutors presented physical evidence, witness testimony, and even some written records that had survived the attempted cover-up. The defendants offered various defenses. Some claimed they were following orders from higher command, though no such orders were ever documented. Some argued that American bombing had created a siege mentality and breakdown of discipline, as if this excused ritualistic cannibalism. General Tachibana claimed he ate human flesh only once and didn't know it was human at the time, a claim the tribunal rejected as implausible given the context. Others simply denied involvement despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The tribunal was unmoved. In August 1947, the verdicts were delivered. General Tachibana, death by hanging. Admiral Mori, death by hanging. Major Matoba, death by hanging. Captain Nakajima, death by hanging. Captain Yoshi, life imprisonment. Several other junior officers and enlisted men received prison sentences ranging from 5 years to life. The executions were carried out in 1948. The condemned men were hanged at Guam's naval base and buried in unmarked graves. Justice, such as it was, had been served, but questions remained that would haunt everyone involved. Here's what makes the Chichijima case especially disturbing from a historical perspective. The American government deliberately suppressed the full details for decades. The war crimes trials were conducted, verdicts were reached, executions were carried out, but the specific details about the cannibalism were kept classified. Families of the victims were told their sons had been executed as prisoners of war, but not about what happened to their bodies afterward. Why? Several reasons, all pragmatic and all morally questionable. First, American occupation authorities in Japan were trying to rebuild the country as a Cold War ally. Publicizing atrocities like Chichijima would inflame anti-Japanese sentiment and complicate reconstruction efforts. Second, the details were so shocking that authorities feared they would traumatize the victims' families beyond what they had already suffered. Third, and perhaps most cynically, George H.W. Bush had survived, returned home, and was building a political career. The story of 9 men shot down over the same island, with 8 being eaten and 1 becoming a future president, was almost too grotesque for public consumption. The full story didn't emerge until the 1990s, when historian James Bradley researched his father's service as a corpsman during the Battle of Iwo Jima. Bradley's investigation led him to the Chichijima records, and in 2003 he published Flyboys, a book that finally revealed the complete story. By then, George H.W. Bush was out of office, having served as president from 1989 to 1993. When asked about Chichijima, he acknowledged his good fortune, but declined to discuss the fate of the other airmen in detail, saying it was too painful and that he'd thought about it many times over the decades. He never publicly addressed the cannibalism specifically. Whether out of respect for the victims' families or personal discomfort, we'll never know. The revelation of the cannibalism sparked renewed debate about war crimes, justice, and historical memory. Some argued the full story should have been revealed immediately, regardless of political consequences. Others maintained that protecting the victims' families from the full horror was an act of mercy. What's undeniable is that suppressing the truth allowed the crime to be minimized and partially forgotten, which serves no one except those who would prefer history's darkest chapters remain hidden. The Chichijima cannibalism forces us to confront several disturbing realities about human nature and warfare. First, these were not psychopaths or sadists. Major Matoba and the other officers were educated, professionally trained military men. They were operating within a military structure, following the forms and procedures of legitimate command. What transformed them into cannibals was a combination of factors: dehumanization. Allied forces, especially American airmen, were portrayed in Japanese propaganda as subhuman monsters. This made it psychologically easier to treat them as objects rather than human beings. isolation, and impunity, Chichijima was cut off from higher command. The officers knew they could act without immediate accountability. Cultural context. Some scholars point to historical Japanese warrior traditions about absorbing enemies' strength, though it's critical to note that these were fringe beliefs, not mainstream Japanese culture, and the cannibalism at Chichijima violated Japanese military law. Breakdown of restraints. In extreme wartime conditions, normal moral and legal restraints can collapse, especially when leadership actively encourages transgression. None of this excuses the crime. Understanding is not forgiveness, but it does reveal something terrifying. Ordinary, educated people can commit extraordinary evil when the right or wrong conditions align. Second reality, the randomness of fate. George H.W. Bush survived because a submarine happened to be in the right place at the right time, because the current carried him away from shore rather than toward it, because American fighters provided cover long enough for rescue. The 8 men who died were no less brave, no less skilled, no less deserving of life. They simply had worse luck. One of them could have been a president instead. One of them could have lived to 94 years old, had children and grandchildren, contributed to society. Instead, they were murdered and eaten. The arbitrariness is almost unbearable to contemplate. Third reality, justice is incomplete. The officers who committed these atrocities were executed, but only the senior officers. Many junior participants received light sentences or no punishment at all. Some simply were never identified or charged, and the systematic suppression of the full truth meant that the victims' families were denied complete knowledge of what happened to their sons. Is justice served when the truth is hidden? When families are protected from knowledge they have a right to possess? These are questions with no easy answers. Today, Chichijima is a quiet island again, home to about 2,000 people. Tourists visit for diving and dolphin watching. The wartime fortifications are slowly being reclaimed by jungle. Life continues, peaceful and ordinary. There is no memorial to the 8 American airmen who were murdered and cannibalized there. No marker indicating what happened. Most visitors have no idea of the island's dark history. In the United States, the story remains largely unknown despite Bradley's book. It's too disturbing, too uncomfortable, too grotesque for popular historical memory. George H.W. Bush died in 2018 at age 94, having lived a full life. President, father, grandfather. By all accounts, he was haunted throughout his life by the knowledge that he survived while his squadron mates didn't. He never knew, or perhaps never allowed himself to fully acknowledge, the specific fate his 2 crewmen suffered, or the horror experienced by the other 6 airmen shot down that day. The families of the 8 victims eventually learned the truth, decades after the war. How they processed that knowledge, how they reconciled the horror with their grief, is private and personal. What remains is the lesson, the terrible, essential lesson that Chichijima teaches. That civilization is thinner than we like to believe. That education and culture provide no automatic protection against barbarism. That in the right conditions, ordinary people can commit atrocities that seem impossible until they've happened. And that fate, pure random chance, determines who becomes a president and who becomes a victim of cannibals. 9 men were shot down over a small island on September 2nd, 1944. One paddled in a raft for 3 hours and was rescued by a submarine. 8 were captured, tortured, murdered, and eaten. The difference between the president and the victims was not virtue, not courage, not skill. It was 3 hours, a submarine in the right place, a current flowing the right direction. That's all. If this story disturbed you, and it should, if it challenged your assumptions about justice, fate, and human nature, then hit that subscribe button. History's darkest chapters are the ones we most need to remember, precisely because they're the ones we most want to forget. The 8 airmen who died on Chichijima deserve to be remembered for who they were, not forgotten because their deaths were too terrible to acknowledge.